Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When Maggie sent me that text, I stared at it for a good 10 minutes before even blinking. "We're only inviting people who've made something of themselves," she wrote, like it was just a harmless detail, like she hadn't just driven a dagger straight through my chest with a smile. It was Saturday afternoon, sunny, with that kind of early fall breeze that always made me think of pumpkin pie and Sunday dinners at Mom's. Except now I was standing alone in my kitchen, holding my phone in one hand and a grocery bag of leftover takeout in the other, suddenly feeling like I'd shown up to a game I was never meant to play in the first place. And the worst part? I didn't even feel surprised. Growing up in our family was like living in a never-ending performance review. Everyone had a resume, whether printed, spoken, or implied, and you were only as good as your last job title, your kid's piano recital, or the number of zeros on your W-2. Maggie with her shiny house in the suburbs, her lawyer husband who never wore the same tie twice, and her perfect, overly polite twins, had long ago earned the title of the one who did everything right. I, on the other hand, was the cautionary tale. The one who left her cushy job at a Fortune 100 company to chase a startup dream, as Dad liked to put it. Always with air quotes and a grimace like I'd told him I planned to start selling crystals on Etsy. But I wasn't broke. I wasn't flailing. I was grinding. I was working 16-hour days, taking investor calls on the treadmill, skipping lunch, skipping sleep, and occasionally wondering what the hell I was doing with my life, but never giving up. I was building something real, just quietly, and apparently, quiet doesn't get you an invite to dinner anymore. So yeah, when that text came through, I didn't reply. I didn't fight it. I didn't argue or try to prove my worth with some highlight reel of what I'd accomplished in the past year. Instead, I did what any emotionally mature adult who's been ghosted by their own blood might do. I ordered a ridiculous amount of Thai food, changed into sweatpants, and prepared to eat all of it on my couch while watching reruns of some show I was too distracted to follow. That night was supposed to be about connection and family, at least that's what Mom always said. But for me, it was just pad thai, wine, and silence. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad at first. Mostly I felt small, like I'd been quietly erased by people who were supposed to know me best. And then, somewhere between the spring rolls and the mango sticky rice, a different kind of feeling started to kick in. Not anger exactly, more like the slow, steady burn that started in my chest and kept spreading the more I thought about that stupid text. Made something of themselves, as if making something had to be visible, impressive, worthy of Facebook photo albums and group toasts. As if the fact that I hadn't shared every tiny win made those wins less real. The thing is, I hadn't told anyone in my family what I'd been working on. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to protect it, like a match you cover with your hand in the wind. It was fragile for a long time, but in the last few months, that match had turned into something else. And on that night, of all nights, that thing was finally catching fire. I was halfway through pouring myself another glass of wine when my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Maggie or my mom or any of the cousins who had suddenly decided I didn't count. It was my co-founder, Sam, and his message was just 2 words. It's time. Suddenly, the weight in my stomach had nothing to do with noodles or wine. I set the glass down, walked over to my laptop, and opened the spreadsheet that had been sitting in a private folder for months. The numbers were all there: projections, user growth, revenue streams, partner offers. The kind of numbers that made people either very nervous or very rich. And tonight, they were about to make someone both. We'd been in talks with a major tech company, let's just call them Big Red, for over 8 months. And that evening, while my sister was passing the gravy to my dad and making small talk about real estate, I was stepping into the final stretch of a $120 million acquisition. I clicked the Zoom link Sam had sent. My face popped up on screen, followed by 5 others in suits. We didn't exchange pleasantries. Everyone knew what was on the line. The deal was complicated. There were last-minute details that needed ironing out. Equity splits, IP ownership, executive roles post-sale. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't headline-grabbing yet. But as I sat there negotiating terms worth more than my entire family's combined net worth, I felt something shift, not just professionally, but personally. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't hoping for anyone's validation. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was already seen, just not by them. The meeting ended 2 hours later. Contracts were being drafted. The lawyers would be up all night. And I closed my laptop, stood up, stretched, and smiled. It wasn't official yet, not publicly, but it was real, and the world was about to find out. That's when my phone buzzed one last time. Another text, not from Maggie, not from Mom. This time, it was from a news alert app I didn't even remember downloading. Breaking: Startup XYZ in final talks for $120 acquisition. Sources say deal is being led by co-founder Alexandra Green. And there it was, my name. On the same night, I wasn't worth a dinner invitation. I looked at the screen, took a sip of wine, and whispered out loud to no one. Let's see who's made something of themselves now. I woke up the next morning before the sun had a chance to peek through my blinds, not because I'd set an alarm, but because my mind had decided there was no time left for sleep, no space for dreams or rest when the day ahead held the potential to shift the very axis of my life. My heart was already in motion before I even threw back the covers, pounding against my rib cage like it had taken over my entire system, as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to the ground when everything around me felt like it might lift off. The sky outside was still that pre-dawn gray, the world silent in that heavy way it gets when something big is about to happen. And for the first time in a long while, I felt an odd mix of fear and anticipation, not unlike the feeling you get when you're standing at the edge of a cliff, toes curled over the rock, knowing you're about to jump and there's no going back. I didn't take a shower. I didn't need to. I wasn't trying to impress anyone with perfume or eyeliner. Today wasn't about appearances. It was about steel nerves, strategy, and making sure not one piece of what we'd built got swallowed up or reshaped into something I wouldn't recognize. I tied my hair up, shoved on the same hoodie I wore when I was writing the first lines of code for our product, and made myself a single strong cup of coffee, the kind that left your throat a little burnt but woke up your whole brain. I didn't eat, couldn't really. My stomach was too tight for food, too full of calculations and conversations I hadn't even had yet. The meeting was scheduled for 8, and by 7:15, I was already sitting at my desk. Documents open, Zoom links loaded, every possible version of every pitch slide queued up and ready to go. Sam, my co-founder, had sent over a final checklist in the middle of the night, and I'd already gone through it 3 times, each item a quiet reminder that this thing, this deal, was no longer some hypothetical dream whispered between us in a garage or over late-night ramen. It was real, and it was happening. And by the end of the day, our tiny company might belong to someone else. At 7:55, the executive team from Big Red started trickling into the Zoom room, their names and titles flashing in that soulless little box, each one carrying a kind of weight that reminded me how far we'd come from scribbling ideas on napkins and cold emailing investors. They all wore the same polished expressions: lawyers, board members, advisors, each with a copy of our numbers and a mental scorecard in hand, ready to pick us apart if they sensed even a second of hesitation. And leading the charge, right in the center tile, like a character ripped out of a business school case study, was Tommy Hess, Big Red's senior M&A lead, the kind of guy who probably spent more on wristwatches than I'd made in my first 3 years of running this company. Tommy had always made me uncomfortable, and not because he was sharp, he was painfully so, but because he smiled the way people do when they're waiting for you to mess up so they can graciously swoop in and clean up your disaster. We'd spoken only twice before in person, both times ending with him saying something like, "You've done well, especially considering your background," which was code for, "You don't come from Harvard or Wall Street, so this must be a fluke." And this morning, with all eyes watching, he greeted me with that same slick condescension, a smirk barely hidden behind the professionalism. "Alex," he said, nodding as if we were old colleagues instead of two people on opposite ends of a multi-million-dollar chessboard. "Ready to show us how Scrappy really wins?" I smiled back, though my stomach clenched, and replied with a level tone I'd practiced in the mirror more times than I'd admit. "Only if you're ready to see what well-funded Scrappy looks like." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of slides, questions, financial projections, and controlled tension. Every time someone asked about user retention, I was ready. When they poked holes in our roadmap, I patched them with facts and numbers that had taken weeks to verify. When Tommy pushed back on valuation twice, I held the line. Because I knew what we'd built. I knew what we were worth. And more than that, I knew this was the last time I would have to prove it to someone who saw my hoodie and thought I was playing dress-up in a space built for men in suits. But it wasn't all smooth. Halfway through, just when I was starting to feel like the momentum had swung in our favor, Sam sent me a private message that nearly knocked the breath out of me. "There's a discrepancy in the user acquisition numbers. Last update didn't push. We're missing April." I clicked over to the spreadsheet and saw it, clear as day. A massive hole in our Q2 metrics that made it look like we'd dipped in growth when we'd actually surged. If they noticed, we could lose the leverage we'd spent months building. My hands went cold, but I kept my face still. I knew I had maybe 60 seconds to either cover it up or fix it without raising alarms. So I muted myself, pulled up the original raw data, and fired off a Slack message to Anita, our head of growth and my unofficial secret weapon, who, thank God, responded instantly. Within 5 minutes, she had patched the file, updated the dashboard, and saved the entire deal without ever having to speak a word. I dropped the new slide into the deck mid-sentence, pivoted my answer to include the new data, and by the time Tommy raised an eyebrow, I was already moving on to our Q3 projections, cool and composed like the glitch had never existed. By the end of the session, I could see it on their faces. They were in, maybe not fully, maybe not officially, but the tone had changed. They asked fewer questions, they nodded more. Even Tommy had toned down his performative skepticism. The offer, we knew, would come by the end of the day. The lawyers would haggle over the details, but the heavy lifting was done. The room, for once, belonged to me. As I clicked out of the call and leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling, I felt my entire body exhale. This wasn't the end, not even close, but it was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not just to close a deal, but to walk into a space filled with power, hold my ground, and walk out without flinching. And then, just as I was about to log off for the day, my phone buzzed again. An alert. Not from Maggie, not from anyone in my family. Just a single line from the board's private Slack channel. "Final offer is in. You're not going to believe the number." There's a specific kind of silence that falls in a room after something seismic has just happened. A silence not of peace but of magnitude, as if even the air around you is trying to understand the weight of what's just shifted, like it too needs a moment to process that everything which existed before is now part of a past you'll never quite return to, and that's exactly what surrounded me in the minutes after I read the number in that Slack message. A number so large and laced with so much meaning that, for a full 30 seconds, I genuinely thought I might be dreaming, because that kind of validation doesn't usually arrive quietly in the form of a ping on your phone. It comes in movies, in ceremonies, in champagne-soaked celebrations filled with cheers and applause, not while you're sitting alone in your apartment with your hair tied back and a coffee-stained hoodie still clinging to your shoulders. 120 million. The number itself wasn't just money. It was history, effort, endurance, and more than anything else, proof. A silent rebuttal to every sideways glance, every passive-aggressive family comment, every whispered remark from friends of friends who wondered when I'd get a real job or settle down like everyone else in our peer group had seemed to do so effortlessly. I didn't scream, I didn't jump up and down, I didn't even smile at first. I just sat there, blinking slowly at the screen, reading the offer again and again as though the sheer repetition might anchor the moment in reality, might carve it into stone so that I could never doubt later that it truly happened. Sam called within 5 minutes, and when I picked up, there was a pause before either of us spoke, like we were both waiting for the other to confirm that this wasn't some strange hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. "You saw it?" he asked, and I could hear the disbelief woven into the calmness he was trying so hard to maintain, like a kid trying not to cry during his graduation speech. "Yeah," I said, my voice low, quiet, steady, even as my pulse kicked harder and harder against my neck. "I saw it." We didn't say much else. There was nothing left to explain. The next 24 hours would be a whirlwind of legal fine print, press release drafting, final negotiation tweaks, and probably a dozen phone calls from people who had never answered our emails before. But the core of it, that moment of realization, that shift in identity from struggling founder to successful one, was done. We'd made it. We had crossed the invisible line that separates those who dream from those who are remembered. After we hung up, I didn't rush to call anyone else. I didn't text Maggie or my mother or any of the cousins who were probably still digesting roast beef and mashed potatoes and congratulating themselves on another wholesome family gathering. I didn't feel angry anymore or even hurt. I felt something else, something weightier and harder to name. Maybe it was vindication, maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was just the awareness that once you finally win, really win, the people you expect to be proud of you are often the ones least capable of understanding what the win actually cost. I stood up, walked out onto the balcony, and looked out over the city. The lights were still on in a few apartment windows, the occasional hum of traffic below serving as the only reminder that the world was still spinning, indifferent to the life-changing moments unfolding above it. I sipped what was left of my lukewarm wine, leaned against the railing, and let the weight of it all settle into my bones. The years of second-guessing, the missed birthdays, the 70-hour weeks, the meetings that went nowhere, the pitches that fell flat, the investors who said no until someone finally said yes. I thought about the night Maggie had told me she was pregnant, how she called me before she called anyone else, crying with joy and fear, how I'd stayed on the phone for 2 hours talking her through the unknown. I thought about the time I helped my mom write her retirement speech, the way she called afterward to say it went so well that people asked her if she had it professionally written. I thought about the things I'd done for these people, not for approval, but because I loved them, and how quickly they decided I wasn't worthy of a place at the table simply because I hadn't yet become someone they could boast about in polite conversation. Inside, my phone buzzed again. I went back to check it, expecting another ping from a teammate or lawyer. But it wasn't that. It was a notification from a news app, one of those generic alerts you usually swipe away without reading. But this one had my name in it. I opened it. A headline, already live. Startup co-founder Alexandra Green leads $120 million. Acquisition, female-led tech, breakthrough shakes up market. I stared at it for a moment, then took a slow breath. So this was it. The moment my name became a headline, the moment strangers would read about me before my own family did, the moment the people who didn't think I was worth inviting to dinner might learn about my success the same way they learned about weather or traffic, through a push notification that said everything they didn't want it to hear. It didn't feel triumphant the way I thought it would. It didn't feel like a movie ending or some grand "I told you so." It felt quiet, sober, deeply personal, like a closed door finally swinging open, not with fanfare, but with a slow creak that echoed through a house where I'd been knocking for years. I walked back into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh glass of wine, and opened the draft email Sam had sent over. Subject line, press release approval. It was clean, polished, filled with buzzwords and big names. It didn't mention the nights I cried on my bathroom floor, or the panic attacks, or the time I sold my car just to make payroll. It didn't mention the couch dinners, or the feeling of being invisible to the people you once thought would cheer you on no matter what. I read it over. I made one change. I added a quote. This acquisition is about more than money. It's about proving that success doesn't always come from the most obvious places. And then I hit send, because tomorrow the whole world would know. And my family? They'd read about it just like everyone else. The moment the press release went live and my name found its way into news feeds and inboxes and morning newsletters, alongside words like historic, record-breaking, and game-changer, something in the atmosphere shifted. Not in some grand cinematic way with music swelling or champagne corks popping, but in a quieter, heavier, more visceral sense. Like the air around me got thicker, the gravity just a touch heavier, as if the world had finally realized it had to make room for me after pretending for so long that I wasn't there. The sun had just started to rise over the city skyline when my phone began buzzing in that relentless, almost manic way it does when something unusual is happening. A barrage of vibrations and pings that refused to stop. And for a few disoriented seconds, I thought maybe there had been an emergency, a national alert, a system-wide failure. But no, this was something else entirely, something personal, something earned. I sat up in bed, disheveled and still in the clothes I'd passed out in, my laptop half open on the nightstand next to an empty wine glass and a scribbled post-it with 3 items I needed to chase that morning. Confirm legal counsel for closing, finalize equity split communication for the team, and reply to the journalist from Tech Frontiers, asking for a post-announcement interview. But that list instantly took a backseat the moment I unlocked my phone and saw the notifications. LinkedIn congratulations, Twitter mentions, Instagram stories with my face tagged from screenshots of the headline, emails from old college professors, mentors I hadn't spoken to in years, VC firms that had once ghosted me now suddenly expressing renewed interest in future collaborations, and scattered between all of that digital noise, something that felt far more jarring than any external praise. The familiar names of family members who, only 48 hours ago, didn't think I was worth a seat at the table. There was a text from my cousin Bethany, whose only contribution to our last conversation had been an awkward laugh and a subtle dig about some people still figuring things out. She wrote, "OMG, I just saw the news. We're all so proud of you." A message from my Aunt Lorraine followed shortly after. "Your mom must be over the moon. This is huge, sweetie. Come by the house when you can. We'll celebrate properly." And then the one I hadn't expected. Not this soon anyway. My father, in his usual blunt tone, had sent a simple text. "Saw the article. Impressive. We should talk." I didn't respond to any of them, not out of spite or malice, but because in that moment, I genuinely didn't know how to translate everything I was feeling into words that would make sense to people who had so consistently failed to understand who I really was and what I had been building all of this time. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes with success when it arrives in a vacuum, when the people who cheered loudest weren't there when it was hard, when their support only showed up once the scoreboard flashed a number they could understand. And yet, as I scrolled through those messages, I didn't feel bitter. I felt clear. Like fog had finally lifted off the years of trying to prove my value, trying to explain what I was chasing, trying to convince people that building something with your bare hands, something no one else could see yet, was a kind of courage that couldn't be quantified on a resume or measured against a white picket fence. By 9 o'clock, the congratulatory emails from inside the industry started rolling in. Executives, engineers, partners from other firms who'd followed our progress quietly from the sidelines and now wanted to connect, set up meetings, explore synergies. My assistant Mia texted to ask if I wanted to reschedule the investor call that had been planned for the afternoon, since everyone's too busy reading about you to ask questions right now, and I laughed out loud for the first time in days because the absurdity of it, the rapid shift from irrelevance to visibility, was almost too much to take seriously. But all of that paled in comparison to the message that arrived just after 11. It came through WhatsApp, which was odd because Maggie never used it, not for family at least, and I assumed it was spam until I opened it and saw her name, her profile picture, her familiar punctuation style. Her message was short, awkward in the way that apologies never quite hit right when they're delivered after the fact, when the damage is already done and the person on the receiving end has long since stopped bleeding. She wrote, "Saw the article? Guess I was wrong. Congrats, really. Can we talk? We're having dinner again tonight, same group. Would love for you to come. Bring wine." I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because part of me, maybe a bigger part than I wanted to admit, had been waiting for that moment. The invitation, the apology, the quiet acknowledgement that she'd misjudged me, underestimated me, boxed me in and slammed the lid shut without realizing I was just biding my time. And now here it was, dangled in front of me like a peace offering, as though we could just rewind the tape and start over because the world had suddenly decided I was worth paying attention to. But this wasn't a movie. There were no orchestrated reconciliations, no montage of healing conversations and wine-soaked laughter. This was real life, and in real life, wounds don't close just because someone sends you a text and tells you they're proud. Still, I didn't delete the message. I didn't ignore it either. I left it there, open, unread, but not unseen. A digital olive branch floating in limbo, waiting for me to decide whether I wanted to accept the seat they were now offering, or if I preferred the one I'd built myself from scratch. Solitary, maybe, but solid. I closed my phone, walked to the mirror, and looked at myself. Not in a performative way, not to admire or critique, but just to witness the person staring back at me, the woman who'd built a company, landed a deal, changed her life, and still felt strangely unsettled. Like the victory hadn't quite landed the way she thought it would. Maybe that was the truth about success. It doesn't fix what's broken, it just gives you the power to decide what to carry forward and what to leave behind. The decision I knew was coming. Dinner was in a few hours. The invitation sat there, blinking, waiting, and I hadn't yet decided whether I would show up. The hours leading up to the dinner passed not in a blur, but with an excruciating, deliberate slowness, the kind of time distortion you experience only when your brain is wrestling with something far bigger than logistics or calendar blocks, or how much traffic you'll hit on the way. No, this wasn't just another evening plan. It was a moment wrapped in memory and emotion and the weight of an entire lifetime of complicated relationships, expectations, slights both subtle and savage, and unspoken resentments that had calcified into a sort of emotional scar tissue no one ever acknowledged, but everyone carried, whether they admitted it or not. I kept checking the clock, not because I was late, but because I was still undecided, still hovering in that gray space between fight and flight, unsure whether accepting the invitation was a victory or a surrender, whether showing up meant reclaiming something that had been stolen or validating a room full of people who hadn't cared enough to keep a seat warm for me in the first place. I went through the motions as if watching someone else do them, pulled on a sweater that felt neutral enough to avoid commentary, touched up the minimal makeup I'd thrown on earlier for a last-minute podcast interview, and stared at the bottle of wine I'd grabbed from the cabinet, the same one I was apparently expected to bring, like some dutiful guest who had never been told, in writing no less, that she wasn't invited to begin with. The absurdity of it made me laugh under my breath. Not in humor, but in that cynical, disbelieving way you do when, life starts to parody itself. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a stage. And for the first time, I wasn't just being asked to watch. I was being cast in a leading role. I wasn't sure I wanted to play anymore. I sat in the car for 7 minutes outside Maggie's house, staring up at the carefully landscaped yard and the warm yellow lights spilling out from the living room, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and glass clinking and the occasional high-pitched voice of one of her twins yelling from somewhere deep inside. It was a scene out of a Hallmark movie, pristine, curated, aggressively wholesome, and I couldn't help but wonder how many of the people inside even knew I was coming, whether this was something Maggie had floated past them with a nervous laugh, or if she'd warned them, braced them, told them to be on their best behavior, like I was some investor with a clipboard and a 5-star rating to give. When I finally walked to the front door, I didn't hesitate. Not because I was confident, but because hesitating would have meant turning around, and turning around would have meant regret. Maggie opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been standing just behind it the entire time, listening for my footsteps on the front path. She smiled, a tight, restrained version of the one she used to give teachers or pastors or anyone she needed to impress, and said, "You made it," as though the last few months hadn't happened, as though the message she'd sent days ago hadn't been a deliberate exclusion, but a harmless misunderstanding, some minor oversight they could gloss over now that my name had become something they could Google with pride. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of garlic and rosemary, and the kind of forced politeness that only families can perfect. A strange cocktail of over-enthusiastic greetings and sideways glances and too many people talking at once energy that had always made me feel like I was standing in the middle of a crowd where everyone knew the choreography but me. I nodded at the cousins, the aunts, the family friends who had always hovered around the edges of our gatherings, never quite close enough to see the fractures but close enough to repeat what they heard. Dinner itself was a blur of dishes being passed, stories being told, people leaning across each other to refill glasses and compliment the stuffing, all while pretending the air wasn't filled with questions no one wanted to be the first to ask. My father sat at the head of the table, as usual, carving the roast with a precision that would have seemed ceremonial if I didn't know it was his way of asserting control. He hadn't said much since I arrived, just a few grunted acknowledgments and one nod of approval when I handed him the wine bottle, as if that somehow absolved both of us from everything left unsaid. It wasn't until dessert, pecan pie with a store-bought crust Maggie had tried to pass off as homemade, that the room finally quieted enough for anyone to actually speak with intention. My uncle asked about the acquisition casually, like he was asking about a new car, and when I gave the brief, sanitized version of the story, the table murmured its approval, its delight, its surface-level congratulations that felt more like politeness than pride. And then Maggie raised her glass, red wine half gone, her eyes a little too shiny, and said, "To Alexandra, for making something of herself in a way none of us saw coming." It was supposed to be kind, I think. A gesture, maybe even an apology cloaked in toast form, but something in the phrasing, in a way none of us saw coming, stung more than I expected, because I had seen it coming. Every late night, every hard call, every moment of doubt followed by stubborn resolve, I had seen it clearly. And the fact that no one else had, that they'd only believed once it hit the news, felt less like a celebration and more like an indictment of just how little faith they'd ever really had in me. So I raised my glass too, met her eyes, and smiled with all the calm I could muster. To the people who only make room for you once you've already arrived. There was a pause, just a beat, long enough to register, not long enough for anyone to call it out. Then someone laughed awkwardly, and the conversation shifted again, and the moment passed like mist. I took a bite of pie. It was too sweet. And as I sat there surrounded by people who suddenly wanted to claim me now that I was worth something on paper, I realized that success doesn't just change how the world sees you. It also changes how you see the world. It peels back the layers. It clarifies. And what I saw now was a table full of people who had underestimated me, not because they didn't love me, but because they only knew how to measure worth in ways I'd never cared to emulate. I didn't storm out. I didn't lecture. I didn't demand apologies or make declarations. I just smiled, finished my pie, and let the silence speak. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's knowing you don't need them to be right.